Fourth F3 here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Different venue this year for those that have come in the past. We used to host this at a convention center, but the constant feedback, the consistent feedback we got after we did surveys is everybody complained about the food. And that's true of any convention center, no disrespect to Chattanooga's convention center, but it's not exempt from that. And so this year we decided to do it here at the Choo Choo and take advantage of this entire campus. This is a historical hotel. It used to be the train station for Chattanooga, the Southern Railway, which I think is fitting for a freight conference to be. In fact, we have Norfolk Southern here later today, so we'll be talking about the history of the railroad, but also where the future of it's headed. And this is a railroad town. So welcome. Really excited to have everyone here. This is a new experience. A friend of mine that runs events says every 4 to 5 years you have to reinvent yourself. And this is our attempt to do that. We hope that you got the $100 meal voucher card. You can use that at any of the participating restaurants. There's a list of them. If you go out into the tent, you can see the list of those restaurants. It's also available on your mobile app, so be sure to take advantage of that. That's how we are serving lunch. There's also some private events that you are welcome to participate in. And then we have a whole series of entertainment this evening as well as tomorrow night. But really excited to have you here. We have an amazing lineup. I think the freight market is going through a very interesting time. So many different stories are happening across it, whether it's the administration's focus on immigration, the administration's focus on some of the compliance issues. It's really shifting the way things work. We have a big, massive railroad merger that's taking place. And then, of course, the geopolitical backdrop, which we're going to hear from Leland Miller, the definitive expert on what's happening on the ground in China and really Trans-Pacific relations here shortly to talk about what that relationship looks like. We have been hosting events at FreightWaves since 2018. And I remember the first one we did in Atlanta, we focused on things like autonomous trucks. I believe in those days in the Freight Tech Awards is that Nikola, Trevor Milton's company that turned out to be a fraud, actually was either was number 1 or number 2 of the Freight Tech Awards. And it's interesting how we now know the end of that story. And through the last couple of years, there's been a lot of new technologies that have come out. And I think we're starting to see sort of the next wave of those startups. This would probably be the second or arguably the third generation of freight tech. And if you think about the sort of born on date of venture capital investing in freight was in 2015, we got the first wave was, people focusing on autonomous trucks. And when we first hosted our first event, we had 25 different vendors that were in the autonomous truck race. Now that had raised money. Now there's about 2 that are still around. We also had things like blockchain. But I think the story this year is all about AI. And really AI is empowering sort of the next generation of startups. But of course, freight fraud is a major issue. It continues to be pervasive. And perhaps the fastest growing industry in freight is actually fraud. And there are startups here today. We're going to talk about freight fraud because it is a really important topic that faces really every one of us. And unfortunately, the authorities, the FMCSA, are not doing their part to actually solve it. So it's going to take private industry and companies, many of which are in the room, to actually solve for that. And so excited to sort of hear what is going on in that front and ways that companies can address it and operate in terms of best practices. We are honored to have you here. We're really excited. I hope that you have a fantastic F3. It's really important that you give us feedback after your experience. We do take these things. We always have a post-mortem. We spend a couple of hours going through all the comments, all the feedback so that the experience can get better. And so we know this is a new venue, it's a new experience, it's a new format. We hope you enjoy it, but please do give us feedback so that we can improve upon it next year because we hope to keep this event going for many years in the future. I want to invite our keynote speaker, Leland Miller. He is the definitive expert on China. One of the things about Leland is he started a company called China Beige Book, which does what the Federal Reserve does with their Beige Book, is they go out and interview business owners, both small and large businesses, about what they're seeing on the ground. And as everyone who's paid attention to what takes place in China, you can't really trust the official data or stats or government dialogue from the PRC because they simply have a narrative to sell versus reality. And Leland's business has the opportunity to give us a firsthand account because he does interview business owners. And so in terms of understanding exactly what is happening in the Chinese economy, he is the definitive expert. We're going to talk about China. We're also going to talk about trade relations and tariffs. Recently, he was appointed by Congress, by the Speaker of the House, to actually participate in some of the policy negotiations as well as positioning on trade policy, as it's a very important topic. So with that, Leland, everyone, please give Leland a hand. So Leland, we had the chance last night at our supply chain day to talk about, so some of the folks that were in the room, obviously a much smaller group, to talk about what's happening with China. But I'd love to sort of start this conversation. You have the source of information on what is actually happening in the Chinese economy that is different than a lot of the media narratives that are out there. I remember back in 2022, we saw the collapse in exports out of China. And a lot of the major media was talking about the surge of imports. You were the only guy that I found that actually knew what was talking about, had data to back it up, that was matching what we were seeing on the ground. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we had the chance to meet. Tell us about what you're seeing right now.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I love FreightWaves. This is the fourth year I've been here, third or fourth year I've been here, and I love the audience. I love the environment, and I love talking about supply chains, not just China, because this is the topic du jour. It was a few years ago, but nobody realized it. Now people are actually realizing. So very happy to be here. Look, China's an interesting story because markets are almost always bipolar on what's happening in China. They either think that China's doing really, really well and the government's getting ready to stimulate either because there's so much weakness or because of something else. They're really excited about it. Or they think we're on the edge of a cliff and there's going to be a hard landing tomorrow and the economy's going to be a mess. One of the reasons we started China Beige book was that that's just not the way China works. It's not just one China, it's a bunch of little Chinas, and we collect data from the ground up to see this. So most of the time you have a very nuanced story that can't be captured with one or two or four data points. GDP growth of 4.8%. What does that mean? A PMI of 52. What does that mean? So what this actually means through the lens of our data is that China is quite weak right now, but it's okay. And what I mean by that is, a lot of people look at the Chinese economy, particularly the policymaking side, and they say, wow, China's a mess. China's economy is going to fall apart. China's, drowning in some sort of terrible, lack of consumption story, property bubble blowing up story. And look, there's all of those weak things happening. But the economy is going steady enough that it's just not a problem now. So within the range of potential outcomes, you're not going to have a super strong economy. The economy's slowing down structurally over time, but it's doing okay right now. Our data are actually a lot better than the consensus narrative. It's really worried. They look at these huge numbers that China used to grow at, and these lower numbers China is now looking like it's growing at low single digits. They say, China's slowing, it's falling apart, it's collapsing, whatever the story might be. That's just not happening. It's doing okay. It's not doing great, but it's doing okay. And one of the things that we talked about last night was that the economy really should be seen as a two-speed economy, to two separate economies in China right now. One is the broader macro economy, which is what you see with the GDP number. It's quite weak. It's undergoing a structural slowdown. But there's a subset of this economy that Xi Jinping really cares about and is doing quite well. And we know what these are because he laid them out in something called the Made in China 2025 program. It's advanced technology, it's advanced manufacturing. It's AI, quantum, biotech, robotics, the industries of the future. So it's very interesting about talking about the economy right now is that there really are two separate economies. There's the broader macroeconomy, which is slowing down, It's not doing great, but it's good enough so that Xi Jinping doesn't really care that much unless the bottom, it looks like it's going to fall out. And then the part of the economy that he really cares about, and this is what he thinks will allow for China's rise, the development of the Chinese military, the development of the Chinese advanced technology sector. And so it's really helpful to look at China through the lens of not just one big economic number, perhaps encapsulated by a GDP number, but as two separate economies that are going right now. One's going very well, one's slowing down, but neither of them are in particular pain right now.
So if the sort of core manufacturing, which built the modern China, is your argument that in the vast majority of the sort of lower end production, the economy is suffering? Which means the people ultimately are suffering, right? I was doing some, in the United States, we have the same problem. AI, the stock market has had exponential growth, but the core part of the business that most of the people don't care about is in that manufacturing sector, the stuff that moves freight. There's 35 million people attached to that part of the economy. There's only, I did the math, of all the hyperscalers, 1.8 million, of which 1.1 million of those work for Amazon, and we know the vast majority of those people that work for Amazon are not in the hyperscaler part of it. It strikes me that we have the same problem in the United States, is the majority of the growth of the economy is in AI and these high-tech sectors. But we have a much more service-oriented economy, so we can absorb some of the weakness. China is so manufacturing heavy. What happens to all those people that are employed in these jobs that are not doing well?
Well, they're suffering. Because at the end of the day, Xi Jinping doesn't spend much time worrying about how households are doing, how small firms are doing, how the stock market's doing, how Chinese tech giants are doing. He wants to make sure that China, writ large, is getting stronger and has the technological capabilities to be able to compete with the West. And what happens to the little people is not much of a concern unless it threatens regime stability. One of the interesting things about the Chinese system is it's based around the idea of supply side support at all times. So one of the things that Western economists have been doing for years and years and years in China is say, look, create more of a consumption culture. You've got to get domestic demand to rise so that you can absorb all this stuff. The Chinese leadership says, yeah, okay, never mind. We'll talk the talk about that, but we're not going to actually do anything about it. And what is probably the most important trend that's happened in the last 5 years, since the middle of COVID, is that manufacturing has not just gone up in China, but there's an all-in strategy to increase manufacturing, increase production, increase exports, and it doesn't matter whether the domestic economy is saturated. The idea is about more and more support for the supply side in order to build up the industrial base and to keep control of key supply chains. So, in theory, some Chinese leader would have said, you know what, market demand signals will be helpful here. We've been producing more and more and more and more. There's trade frictions out there. The world's getting mad at us. That's why we're seeing tariffs everywhere, not just the United States. Maybe we should slow down. The opposite has actually happened. So over the last several years, despite the fact that China came out of COVID just as always been a manufacturing powerhouse, but really just having manufacturing metrics going up and up and up throughout COVID. They came out of COVID, instead of saying, okay, let's balance things out, they said, let's double down. And so they've started something called New Quality Productive Forces. What that is Xi Jinping basically saying, we want a whole of government effort to boost production more, to boost exports more. And we are going to produce so much, it's going to saturate our economy, and most industries already have, and then we're going to export it around the world. And we're going to control those supply chains. We're going to control those choke points around the world. And you're seeing that. And that's leading to a lot of trade frictions right now. But it's also in no way convinced the Chinese government to reverse course. So what you have right now is sort of the Chinese economic model, which is based on more production, more exports, just continuing to hammer on that. And the world saying enough is enough. You have to start absorbing some of this, not just your own excesses, but importing others' exports to balance out, the trade balance bilaterally, multilaterally, et cetera. But the Chinese aren't backing down. So you have this enormous conflict right now, and that's why we're in the middle of what has been a very long, extended trade war.
One of the things I've heard about China is that each of the provinces sort of have, if the central government wants to have EVs, then the provinces essentially and entrepreneurs are going out and starting these EV companies, which is something we have like 400 EV companies. And is it your, I mean, sort of observation that ultimately China doesn't care which of those companies win, so long as China wins? And that once the winner is determined, I think BYD is the best example of this. Once a winner is determined, that they will then protect that one entity, or is that a misunderstanding of?
No, I think that's exactly what happened. So if you look at EVs, it's a great example. 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, you started seeing enormous subsidies. And it's not just, government handing out checks to companies. I mean, you're talking about free or subsidized land, cheap credit access, tax rebates on the consumer side and on the production side, just an enormous amount of policy support into these companies. Because she said, look, EVs are one of our advanced technologies that we want to dominate. Let's go get them. And so everyone listens to Xi. That might surprise you, but everyone listens to Xi, including the regional governments. So they said, we're getting in the game. And so you had everybody in China subsidizing their own companies, their own champions, and you had this enormous number of companies created, hundreds of companies and tens of thousands of companies that were supporting those companies. It was just this all-in policy support model. Now, what happens, of course, is two things. One, you get really good companies over time, but two, you have enormous oversupply. And the term that everybody's using right now for oversupply, even though it's not exactly the same thing, is overcapacity. So what China created was enormous overcapacity domestically in EVs, like it did solar, like it is on some other technologies. And now you're at the point where these companies can't possibly survive because domestic demand has been saturated for EVs. Most Chinese have an EV. There's no way that the number of companies producing in China right now are needed for the demand that's there domestically. So what do? They start exporting this. And they don't export a little, they export a lot. And what they're exporting is one, very, very advanced cars. They're really, really good cars. The best cars in the world, the Chinese EVs. But in addition, because there's so much oversupply, they're in a price war. So the price war started out domestically. Hey, we want to make sure we're keeping our market share or just making sure we don't go under. We're going to continue to cut margins. We go negative. Almost every car company in China has negative profits because of this price war. And what do? You start exporting that deflation abroad when you export. So now these AVs are being exported abroad, not to the United States right now because of the 100+% tariffs, but to Europe, to the rest of the world. And domestic industries in those economies can't possibly compete. Because one, you've had this subsidized cocoon in China develop these amazing cars for the past 10 years. But also, the prices are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Chinese car companies aren't operating to make a profit. They're operating not to die. And so the prices are going down and down and down. You've got BYD models, electric car models, very good cars for, a little over $10,000 or 10,000 euros in Europe. And you can't possibly compete with that domestically. So what is happening out is when these Chinese exports arrive, they start hollowing out the industries of around the world, these domestic industries, these domestic car industries. Now take that model, what's happening to autos, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in South America, elsewhere, and just talk about more and more and more different technologies and more overcapacity in different industries that's being exported abroad. And that's the real threat right now coming out of China. It's this overcapacity export surge, which is hollowing out domestic industries worldwide.
And effectively, that just dumps cheap products on these other countries. I mean, the U.S. has been very aggressive, but other countries, I think BYD has a substantial footprint in Europe and in Mexico. I had the chance to interview the president of BYD 3 years ago. I had never heard of BYD. And she told me that they were bigger than Tesla, and I thought she was lying to me. And then I realized this company that had come out of nowhere was actually bigger in terms of the total production than Tesla, but was actually dominating all of these markets. It strikes me that a lot of the decarbonization effort over the last decade, particularly in Europe, has been detrimental to their entire internal combustion market, their car market. I mean, is that part of the strategy to effectively create a fear-mongering around some of these decisions to affect the way that markets behave?
I don't think so, because China has its own problem with industrial, ICE cars. They have enormous overcapacity right now in producing gas guzzlers. And no one wants to buy the gas guzzlers, and they're not subsidized in China. And so what are they doing with their gas guzzlers back home? Well, they're throttling down production, but there's still a ton of production, and they're exporting that abroad. So I think it's, we always get these questions in the policy circles, like what are the Chinese doing intentionally and what are they doing as a consequence of their economic model? It's sometimes very hard to tell. I think you have certain examples, for instance, in technology, where it's very, very clear they want to control the supply chains as a matter of policy. They want to export abroad. They want to gain market share, control key supply chain choke points as a matter of policy. Other times, it is a consequence of their actions. So, for instance, I don't think they have any desire to dominate market share in industrial, to ICE cars. So I don't think that it's always crystal clear. It's just the Chinese economic model is so one-sided that sometimes you have intentional policies that are pushed, and sometimes it's just a consequence of those policies that have ripple effects throughout the world.
I had, so I'm a pilot, and I own a plane called an Icon, which can land on water, and it filed bankruptcy. And this has happened a lot in general aviation, is that Chinese companies, Chinese entities go and buy these companies. But one of the things I found interesting was Icon got purchased in bankruptcy, $15 million. The government, the Chinese government, gave the money to the entrepreneurial family to buy this. And once they owned it, they actually didn't care about running the company because they had gotten the money from the government. But Icon actually had real estate. And the sort of discussion from people that were on the inside was they wanted money from the government. And once the check is written, there are no consequences. That money is now parked in an American. The money's been spent to buy the company, but then they own this real estate and that they don't really care about producing. Is that part of the Chinese model?
Well, I think the part of the Chinese model that you've identified is that, they're not worried about markets. They're not worried about profits. They're worried about control, and they're worried about power. And so, what was happening around the world, especially before we got CFIUS and some other things up domestically, and some of our allies and partners developed their own, is that you'd have Chinese companies come in and just buy up resources. They would buy up companies, and they weren't looking to plot out some forecasting model where they'd get back their investment over time. They said, we want that commodity. We want that industry. We want that technology. And they were gobbling up things all around the world. It was particularly bad in Europe, but it was everywhere. If you look through the lens of critical minerals, which all of a sudden everybody's now paying attention to, China went around the world gobbling up all these critical mineral mines. They weren't doing cost-benefit analysis to see whether they'd get their money back. They wanted to control those commodities so that they could build up supply chain choke points on the rest of the world. And they knew that by controlling these choke points, they would get power in a different way than just simply making profits. And that's why nobody was paying attention, because they let the Chinese have this, let the Chinese have that. Well, over time, in the aggregate, this became a huge problem. And now what happens? Chinese control critical mineral processing all around the world. It comes at you fast.
And this is effectively a second Cold War, where supply chains are the front lines in this, and they're using those supply chains to pressure the United States and Europe to basically perform the way that they want things performed. Is that sort of the understanding?
It is, and I'll tell you that this is great timing to be here, because I'm actually putting out an article in 2 weeks called "The U.S.-China Trade War is Dead, Long Live the Supply Chain War." And what I mean by that is, for all the talk of the phase 2 in U.S.-China relations and all the things that this administration clearly wants to do on trade, the most important issue is no longer trade per se. It's supply chains. It's who controls key supply chain choke points. If you look at it's happening in tariffs. Tariffs are at a very high level, but they're at a manageable level between the U.S. and China. And the reason I say that is, the regime looks very, very different than it ever did. In terms of, but for the U.S., from the Chinese side, tariffs are very high, but they're manageable. And for the U.S. side, they're punitive, but they're also manageable because they are below the level of decoupling. So once you get about 70% tariffs, no Chinese product is cost competitive, or very few Chinese products are cost competitive. So if you want to keep it below 70%, below 50%, I think we have an effective tariff rate probably at around 40%, a little under. Then what you have is high tariffs on China, but you have it not so high as you are permanently disabling the relationship or quickly forcing decoupling. So it's very interesting right now, for all the talk of a phase 2 deal that we may or may not have, going into next year. The higher tariffs that the U.S. has on China and that China has on the U.S. are actually quite sustainable going forward. That's why there's not all that much pressure on either side to change this regime. What is not at all sustainable or what's happening on supply chains. And right now we're finally, beyond sort of a wonky policymaking view, having a broader understanding of what these vulnerabilities are. In critical minerals and rare earth magnets, China controls, 70 to 90% of the sourcing, processing, manufacture of every part of this supply chain. You cannot get these critical minerals, which are needed in defense technology. Rare earth magnets are needed just to put a car together and have a seat that goes back. They're used for everything. And China basically said, after some pushback of the trade war, said no more. If you keep treating us poorly on the trade side, we are going to start cutting off things you care about, and we're going to start with critical minerals and rare earths.
So one of the administration's reactions to that, or perhaps sort of the counterpoint, is that the administration has decided it needs to take a playbook, frankly, from the Chinese, of the government sort of driving in industrial production. And look, we could argue we did the same thing during the Cold War. The military-industrial complex was effectively, the reason Boeing exists is not because they design great airliners, which they do most of the time, but it's because of the military funding that went in to support Boeing. It feels like we're playing almost the same playbook that the Chinese have designed to take it into broader industries. And we've seen even today, this morning, the United States has taken a position in an Australian critical minerals miner. Is that the right play?
Well, I think the playbook for years and years and years, particularly since the 1990s, has been that, markets should control everything. They should make all our decisions for us. And I think most of the time that's probably a very good idea. But what we started to run into is the fact that there's certain national security priorities that we can't allow be controlled by the markets. And the reason for that is if China controls a lot of the supply, it knows this and it can just cut prices in order to knock us out of that market. And then all of a sudden we've deindustrialized in something that has a national security priority. So we talk about critical minerals, talk about Mountain Pass. What the government did recently is recognize that we do not have critical mineral processing in the United States that's sufficient in order to meet even our national security needs. So what are we going to do on that? Are we going to wait to try to figure out the perfect economic model so that we can remain profitable in a world in which China controls so much supply that they cut prices and all of a sudden these firms go bankrupt? No, that we tried. For 2 decades, we tried to get Mountain Pass up and running, based on market economics, and it didn't work. And it didn't work because every time there was a market price for critical minerals, the Chinese would oversupply the market, cut the price, and the firm would effectively go bankrupt. And so the recognition for the past several years, particularly this year, but really the last several years, is that there's certain things that are so important, the government has to become part of the equation. And what they're doing, what the Trump administration is doing on Mountain Pass, for instance, is stepping in and not just taking an equity stake and not just providing policy support for these companies, saying we're setting a price floor. So we don't care what the Chinese companies do in terms of dumping or price cutting and affecting market dynamics. We're going to make sure that you have a price floor to produce at least marginally profitable level going forward, so that we don't lose you as a company, we don't lose this industry domestically. And I think what we're learning about right now is that we're going to have to do this in more and more industries. Now, don't get me wrong. If you do in too many industries, and we are on the verge of doing this on too many industries, then you're going to have a lot of problems too. But I think that the core thought process from this comes from the idea that if we were really just battling pure U.S. model, U.S. Western model, focused on innovation, focused on market signals, and competing against the Chinese model, which is very top-down, authoritarian, central, non-market model, the U.S. model would win that battle about 95% of the time. But what the Chinese model's really, really good at is brute forcing a handful of major priorities and wiping out their competitors. So if you're saying that these are the advanced technologies, if we're taking Xi Jinping's word for it and saying made in China 2025 technologies are going to be what they really care about in the future, again, AI, quantum, biotech, robotics, some of these green technologies, EVs, batteries, hypersonics, et cetera. then we're going to have a mind towards making sure that we can produce some of this stuff either at home or with allies and partners so that we have de-risked ourselves from Chinese leverage in the supply chains. And I think that's the key point of all of this. It's not about reshoring all the manufacturing. A lot of people will talk a big story about reshoring everything. We can't possibly reshore everything. But what we need to do is de-risk supply chains so that our adversaries do not have chokeholds over the supply of important things that we need for our economy to work, and particularly for our defense sector to work. And I think that's what the government's going through right now. I think that's what political parties are tangling with now. It's a change in the orthodoxy in the way that you look at government support for business. Shouldn't be broad support for business, but when you have certain industries with a national security nexus, then maybe the equation, the formula for that is different.
She has, in addition to talking about, some of his industrial sort of roadmap, if you will, one of the other things that he has said is told the Chinese military, I believe it was 26 or 27, they must be in a position or ready to reunite themselves with Taiwan or reunite. Do you believe that is an imminent issue? That we will see a military attack on Taiwan?
See, I was listening very closely to the way you worded that. So is it an imminent issue? It's an imminent issue, of course. Do I think they're going to attack imminently? No, I do not. But I think this is the way to look at it. The 2027 year was created basically out of magic. The reason we're talking about 2027 is that Xi Jinping did give this order to the People's Liberation Army to have the capabilities by 2027 to invade. He didn't say invade in 2027. He said have the capabilities, amphibious and otherwise, to be able to invade by 2027. What the U.S. and its allies did, the Philippines and Japan and others, is they said, okay, well, China's trying to hit that 2027 number. We have to also be cognizant that that's our number too. And so a lot of things happen around 2027 in terms of our scheduling. Here's what goals we have to meet. Here's what technologies we have to have in place. Here's what type of munitions we have to have in place. But 2027 is not an important number in and of itself, a date in and of itself. But I think what's happening is this. We have a real problem right now on a couple fronts. One is we're trying to figure out domestically as a political issue, how important are our allies in Asia? How important is Taiwan and Chinese control of the Taiwan Strait? What do we need to do? What are we willing to do as a country? But we're also looking at how assuming we decide to defend Taiwan, to defend our treaty allies in Asia, do we have the capabilities to do this, considering the Chinese industrial machine is right next door? And this is where it gets really, really difficult, because China's focused on one area in the world. I mean, it does a lot in a lot of places, but it's focused in one area of the world. It's near abroad. It focuses on the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, which is right off its coast. The United States is dabbling in every sandbox around the world. We're involved in the Middle East. We're involved in Ukraine. We're involved, everywhere. And that's not to say we shouldn't be. But it means that while we're talking about building up the capabilities in all these different spots around the world, including Asia, China's basically myopically focused on building up their capabilities off their own coast, which means that it's a very, very difficult game, that the longer we go along, the farther we're potentially going to fall behind. And it's not really falling behind. The military advantage the United States has been quite significant for a while. It's cutting the military advantage down. I think at this point it's flipped. But the reason that we haven't had a war in the Taiwan Strait yet is not because Xi Jinping doesn't want Taiwan. It's that I think everybody involved in the Taiwan Strait right now is worried they're going to lose. China looks at the very difficult, amphibious invasion and thinks, you know what? There's a very good chance, despite our capabilities, we're going to lose. The United States looks at the Taiwan Strait and says, you know what? Despite the fact that we've built up a lot, we have this most powerful Navy in the world, there's a very good chance we could lose. The Taiwanese are sitting back at home saying, wow, there's a very good chance we're going to lose no matter what happens. So nobody's wanted to move forward because the consequences are so great, and there's not confidence by any of the sides involved that they would actually come out ahead with high confidence. So the most important thing right now, in order to avoid a war in Asia, is to make sure that military imbalance doesn't become such that the Chinese believe, wow, we really have the advantage here. and maybe it's a better time to go in is sooner rather than later. Now, we also have issues we should be taking care of. We need to make sure we're not signaling back home things that Xi Jinping or the Chinese leadership are going to interpret as sort of a green light to do things in Asia that we don't want them to do. But a lot of it comes down to capabilities, and a lot of it comes down to getting serious and making sure that we are not, by our inaction in particular, green lighting something that could start a fairly problematic conflict.
I mean, do you think the Ukraine conflict, the using American weapons, has changed China's calculation on how easy it is to, because effectively Russia should have overwhelmed Ukraine, and they didn't. Massive miscalculations, but also those Western weapons, those American weapons, actually changed the entire calculus. And now there's a fighting chance. Who knows? It probably ends up in stalemate more than anything, but there's a fighting chance that Ukraine has because of American weapons. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's changed?
I'd say the biggest single debate, loudest debate, most vociferous debate I had with members of the now Trump administration, both, the run up to the election, through the transition and through the early days, was what is Xi Jinping's message? What is he learning from Ukraine right now? And there were people who said, look, the most important thing is that we support our allies. And, Ukraine, European allies, Ukraine to the extent they're an ally, because Xi Jinping is watching, and you don't want to send a signal that we're not going to support our allies, et cetera. Others are saying, no, Xi Jinping is looking at the military balance, the munitions, and he's very happy about what's happening because we're sending all these munitions that we need in Asia over to Ukraine to use against the Russians. And while that's great in the short term, it means we don't have what we need in an Asia conflict. And I'll tell you, it is a very interesting intellectual argument that doesn't have an answer, so far as we know. What does Xi Jinping care about? What are we doing? What are we doing more harm by being involved in Ukraine or putting too much munitions in Ukraine? I don't think it has an answer. People feel very, very strongly about it. But I think that Xi Jinping is definitely taking lessons from the Ukraine conflict. And I think that as a baseline, if we don't have the munitions to protect our allies in Asia, to be involved in Taiwan Strait conflict or South China Sea conflict if we want to, then that's pretty much a worst case scenario. But short of that, when we're, where do we send our munitions and what signals are we sending to who? It's a really open debate. And even inside the Trump administration, there is a very active and aggressive debate on which one of these things should take precedence.
I mean, ultimately, isn't it all about losing face? I mean, if Putin doesn't care as much about losing face, except for the people who empower him in Russia, Xi cares about how the world perceives him. And if you did have a catastrophe which if the United States got involved, it would be an absolute catastrophe for both sides. But it strikes me that there is so much to lose. It's better to be verbose and threatening than to actually do it, because the moment you do it, you have to just prove it on the field.
I agree, and that's why my personal belief is that Xi doesn't want to go into Taiwan in the short term unless something changes. We send a green light through policy signals. We get involved in a military conflict elsewhere that gets us distracted. I don't think Xi Jinping wants to risk it in the very short term. On the other hand, Chinese patience isn't endless. And one of the reasons that we haven't had a Taiwan imbroglio, a Taiwan crisis, a real Taiwan crisis for decades, has been this idea pushed by the Chinese side that time is on our side. So the longer we wait, the more powerful we'll be, the more likely Taiwan is folded into China, the more likely we'll have a military advantage and be able to make Taiwan do what we want. That entire argument is why you've had an internal justification for waiting on Taiwan. If it looks like the Chinese economy or Chinese military or Chinese advanced technology state is peaking in the short term, then it compresses the window for where there might be a potential Taiwan action. So I do agree that the Chinese leadership, including Xi Jinping, does not want to leap in the short term into a Taiwan crisis, a Taiwan invasion. I think there's so much to lose. It would be the end of the Communist Party if they were humiliated.
One of the other things that I think is fascinating is this argument about how many people actually live in China. And there are official stats, I think it's 1.5 or 1.6 billion. The unofficial stats, or people who study this, are everything from 1.2 to I've heard a few as 700 million. What is your read on the population sort of demographic issue in China? Like, what do you think the population is, and what do you actually think is actually happening there?
I think the best numbers that we have suggest that China is no longer the most populous nation in the world, that India passed it, but that whether or not they have 1.4 billion or 1.3 billion or 1.5 billion, it doesn't really matter. What's important are the trends. And, we haven't spent much time talking about long-term Chinese trends, but when you're talking about long-term Chinese trends, you're always focused on two things. One is debt and the other is demography. And your question really calls in what the focus we should be having in terms of looking at China's long-term trajectory. You've got a shrinking population. You've got a shrinking working age population. You've got a very old population. You've got a very gender unequal population because of the one-child policy. And I think if you look at what happened with the one-child policy, sure, it's been reversed, but the damage will continue for decades and decades. You have much fewer Chinese children growing into adults that will be able to keep the population at a high level. I think in 50 years, we're talking about the population being cut roughly in half. But you also don't have enough of a male-female balance in order to have the population increase. You don't have enough marriage material from both men and women. There's many more men. The population is very old, and so one of the things that one-child policy has done is create a society where there's an only child at the bottom, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and that only child is responsible for supporting everyone of that pyramid as they get toward old age. Now, one of the things you always see in the media is like, oh, China's just going to flip a switch one day and it's going to increase domestic consumption. They're going to increase domestic demand. Chinese households will decide to spend more. Well, one of the reasons that Chinese households can't spend more is that Chinese household is run by a single child that has to pay for all the health care and all the future responsibilities for this entire inverted pyramid of the family. And if you do that, you're going to be a saver, you're not going to be a spender. And I think that's one of the reasons structurally why it's been very, very difficult for the Chinese government to encourage domestic demand, to encourage more spending in China. It's because you have this very, very uneven, upside-down demographic pyramid that makes it very difficult for someone to spend rather than save for the rest of their life, especially considering how small China's social safety net is, compared to the United States and elsewhere.
So Leland, let's shift a little bit back to the United States. The trade war we're on our second trade war, perhaps, or the second iteration of Trump's trade policies. This one has been far more chaotic than even the first one. Where are we at? What is the state of trade, particularly with China, but around the world? And what is sort of the thinking inside the administration?
So let's talk about phase 2. A phase 2 deal has been much less likely than I think markets, investors, have assumed, because they read the headlines and they see Xi and Trump are going to meet and they figure they'll come to a deal, and that may happen. But it's been a lot less likely because they're at the margins, both sides. And we talked to the Chinese side, we talked to the American side. Not everyone's sure of what a deal would actually mean. Now, if President Trump really only wants to get the Chinese to buy a bunch of soybeans, maybe a bunch of Boeing planes, get some sort of top-level cooperation on fentanyl, and that's all this is about, then maybe they can do that if the U.S. is willing to offer some goodies in return. But that's where this gets tricky, because I think when you talk about a phase 2, what do the Chinese want? They don't want tariff relief as a first-order priority. One of the things I mentioned earlier in this discussion was the fact that Chinese tariffs on the U.S. and U.S. tariffs on China are very high, but it's not a priority for either side to bring them down. They're at a sustainable level. What's a first-order priority for the Chinese side is pulling back U.S. export controls on advanced technology. They want the most advanced chips. They want the most advanced chip-making equipment. There's other stuff they want access to that they can't get because there's export controls on. Now, if President Trump were to pull those back, then all of a sudden you're going to have a very willing trade partner with the Chinese. So essentially what we'd be doing is trading something on the trade side for something on the technology control side. If that's the way this develops, I think it'd be very, very bad for the United States, but I do think that there'd be something that Beijing would jump at. But here's the problem. Let's assume even we do have some sort of phase 2 deal. It's a good deal, it's a bad deal, it's a small deal, it's a slightly larger deal, doesn't matter. Because of the supply chain issues we're talking about, none of these tensions are going to go away. Right now, the Chinese for years have been very serious about de-risking their supply chains from the West and from the U.S. in particular. They've been only partially successful on this because of the U.S. power and control of certain industries, but that's been their goal. For only a couple of years has the United States even remotely been focused on doing the same. But we're entering that realm. And I think what you're going to see is a lot of the American attempts to de-risk our supply chains from China, Chinese attempts to de-risk supply chains from America, Europe's part of this too. They want to de-risk from China as much as possible, while they're also looking a little bit warily at the United States right now. Everybody wants to de-risk their supply chains. But because some nations, particularly the United States and China, have really strong choke points on really critical national security related supply chains, it's going to be very difficult to move away from that quickly. The Chinese control critical minerals and rare earths. Yes, we've heard about it. We're reading about that in the media. But they're also control a bunch of other supply chains. One of the other hats that I wear, that Craig had mentioned in the introduction, was as a commissioner of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And we did a hearing in June in Congress, focusing specifically on Beijing's supply chain choke points in the U.S. economy. And this went way beyond critical minerals and rare earth magnets. We're talking about pharmaceuticals. I mean, do you know that Chinese companies control the key starting materials and the APIs for heparin, insulin, amoxicillin, all kinds of antibiotics, so they have the foundational chemicals and processes that create those. They control some of the pharmaceutical supply chains. They control the vast majority of generic pharmaceuticals are either produced in China or produced as starting points in China, shipped to India where they're then produced, but it's all Chinese materials. So pharmaceuticals are an enormous supply chain we haven't even started talking about. Printed circuit boards. This seems like the most boring topic ever, but printed circuit boards go into every electric component we have. The Chinese control the supply chains for that. Not completely, but they control that. Foundational semiconductors. All the talk we have right now are about advanced chips, the ones that go into the most advanced AI systems. Well, if you're talking about 28 nanometer and lower, the Chinese are building up capacity expansion in China that dwarfs all the rest of the world combined. 2-3 years from now, they're going to control foundational semiconductors. And these are the little things that go in everything from a toaster to an airplane to a missile. Extremely important. So the Chinese have their act together. The question, does the United States have its act together? We don't know yet. But at least there's a recognition that you've got these problems and that this is really the future of U.S.-China tensions. It's not trade. It may not even be military. It's supply chains, because this is going to control everything. It's going to control leverage, most importantly, in the relationship.
Leland, you're much closer to the administration than I've been, but the few conversations I've had with folks that are in the White House is almost a level of, and it was true in Biden's administration, it's certainly true in Trump's as well, is a lot of level of ignorance on how supply chains work. I suspect that we're making progress because the administration is certainly doing the things around minerals and rare earth, which is sort of bringing to light these problems. But do you think we have the folks around the president, advising the president, that actually understand how these things work? Or are we sort of learning as we go and figuring out when we break something, we then have to go fix it?
It's a tricky question. Let me see how I'm going to answer this. Obviously, the administration works very differently. Trump 2 versus Trump 1. Trump 1 was very disruptive and move fast and break things, but it was a traditional administration structurally. You had a National Security Council, you had a National Economic Council, you had an interagency process. None of that exists in Trump 2. You just have skeleton processes and a lot of big decisions made by the people at the very top. The way they compensate is they bring in outside experts to talk about things that they care about. I'm one of them. I go in and talk to them about China and tariffs and trade and supply chains all the time. But I think that the reason that they got so focused on supply chains so quickly, particularly critical minerals and rare earths, is because supply chains weren't interesting until they started affecting the trade policy, and then they became really interesting. So the question is it broadly interesting to the administration, all these other supply chain issues yet? And I think the answer is starting to be yes. I think they're looking at pharmaceuticals. How are we going to cut prices for pharmaceuticals in the United States? Well, wait a second. You can't talk about tariffs on generic pharmaceuticals and not be talking about supply chains about pharmaceuticals that come out of China. So I think as they've been digging deeper into ways of restructuring some of these trade issues, they realize at the heart of all these trade issues is a supply chain issue. and that they have to start getting on supply chain, focusing on supply chains much more. I will say they are not there yet. There's nowhere near the focus that needs to be in the administration. There's nowhere near the focus even close in Congress right now. But they are moving in that direction. Compared to 2 years ago, compared to 4 years ago, it's a sea change in terms of the recognition that supply chains are what's going to guide, American policy choices in the future. And we have to be really smart about understanding not just what to do about supply chains, but what's in our supply chains. Who controls them? What are the inputs that come in that we don't understand? And I think there's more of an appreciation right now about getting transparency around these supply chains than any time I've ever seen.
So Leland, last minute, I'd like for you to, hopefully we'll have you back next year. Make a 12-month sort of, what does the world look like, particularly relates to trade and policy with China a year from now? What are we going to be talking about?
So I'll do this with the proviso that you can't put some sort of video of me next year talking about this, because whatever I say is going to be completely wrong. But I understand the trajectory of the relationship right now. I could see some sort of mini trade deal. I could also see the absence of a mini trade deal. And I think the most important thing to understand here is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's not going to affect the medium term or the long term relationship between the United States and China. Because what a trade deal would essentially do is recouple the two economies during a time we're talking about decoupling and de-risking. It confuses everything. So yeah, maybe they buy more soybeans in the United States. Maybe we loosen a few tech restrictions. Yes, maybe you can get that agreement. But it's less important whether we get a phase 2 deal than whether we get the supply chain questions right. So what I think is going to happen next year is, regardless of whether there's a phase 2, and I would put it maybe at like 50%, not to hedge, but it's really about a 50% we actually get a phase 2 trade, maybe 60%, some sort of baby phase 2 trade deal. That a year from now, we're talking about the exact same things, but we're much more focused on supply chains, and we're much more cognizant of the fact that no matter what we do on the trade side, there is no long-term rapprochement until supply chains are de-risked and until the governments can look at this relationship and say, our leverage is not reliant on the supply chains of the other. Then you can possibly make decisions to improve the relationship. But until that happens, I think we're in really rough grounds right now.
Well, Leland, we're out of time, and unfortunately, we could spend another hour talking about this topic, but I really appreciate it. And
It's my
hopefully see
pleasure.
you back next year.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Leland, not everything.